In 1982, 7 people in Chicago were killed by a painkiller. They didn't know each other. They didn't see it coming. In a world filled with noise, some stories are lost in silence, forgotten files, unanswered questions, lives that vanished without a trace. From the shadows of the past, these cases still whisper for the truth. Welcome to Cold Case Archives. The Tylenol murders. In September of 1982, there was nothing unusual about taking a Tylenol. It sat in millions of homes across the United States, trusted without question. A remedy for headaches, sore throats, everyday pain. A brand so familiar it barely registered as medicine anymore. That trust ended in Chicago. 7 people died after swallowing a single capsule. They never saw their attacker, never heard a threat, never suspected danger. There was no warning, no pattern, no escape. The poison was already waiting. Chicago in the early 1980s was a city defined by routine. Commuters filled the trains before sunrise. Neighborhood pharmacies unlocked their doors each morning. Families trusted the same products they had relied on for decades. Tylenol was one of those constants. Manufactured by Johnson & Johnson, it was the most popular over-the-counter pain reliever in the country. By 1982, Tylenol controlled more than a third of the American painkiller market. It was safe. It was reliable. And it was everywhere. There were no tamper-proof seals on the bottles. Capsules could be opened and closed by hand. The idea that someone might deliberately contaminate a household medicine was almost unthinkable. That assumption would prove fatal. On the morning of September 29, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up in her Oak Grove Village home with a sore throat and runny nose. Her parents gave her an extra-strength Tylenol capsule. Within hours, she collapsed. By the time she reached the hospital, doctors could do nothing. Mary was pronounced dead that afternoon. At first, there was confusion. Children did not simply die from sore throats. There were no signs of infection, no history of illness, no visible trauma. Then the calls began. A 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus collapsed at work after taking Tylenol for chest pain. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. His family returned home in shock. Later that same day, Adam's brother and sister-in-law took Tylenol from the same bottle. They never made it back to the hospital alive. 3 deaths from a single bottle. Doctors began to suspect something far more dangerous than illness. Chapter 3. A pattern emerges. As news of the deaths reached emergency rooms across the Chicago area, more cases appeared. A flight attendant, a mother of 4, a young woman caring for her children, all had taken Tylenol. All collapsed suddenly. All died within minutes. Medical examiners finally identified the cause: potassium cyanide. The capsules contained doses hundreds of times stronger than what the human body could survive. This was not contamination. It was execution. Chapter 4. The city realizes. By evening, authorities issued an emergency warning. Residents were told to stop taking Tylenol immediately. Radio stations interrupted programming. Television anchors abandoned scripts. Pharmacies were emptied within hours as people rushed to remove bottles from their homes. Hospitals were overwhelmed by terrified patients who had taken the medication but had not yet shown symptoms. Chicago was no longer dealing with isolated deaths. It was facing an invisible killer, one that had entered homes quietly and without resistance. Chapter 5. The terrifying discovery. As investigators traced the source of the poisoned bottles, one conclusion became unavoidable. The contamination did not happen at the factory. Each bottle came from a different store, different neighborhoods, different suburbs. Someone had taken the bottles from shelves, opened the capsules, filled them with cyanide, resealed the containers, and returned them to the public. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no cameras watching pharmacy aisles. The killer had exploited something no one had thought to protect: trust. Part 2. A nation holds its breath. By the morning of September 30, 1982, The panic had spread far beyond Chicago. What began as a local emergency was now a national crisis. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Newspapers across the country ran front-page headlines warning readers not to take Tylenol under any circumstances. The Food and Drug Administration issued public advisories, and poison control centers were overwhelmed with calls from frightened Americans who had taken the medication in recent days. Hospitals braced for more victims. For many, the most disturbing realization was not the number of deaths, but how ordinary the act had been. These were not people engaging in risky behavior. They were parents, workers, and children doing exactly what they had been taught to do: treat pain with a trusted medicine. As law enforcement agencies coordinated their response, investigators began reconstructing the movements of each poison bottle. Receipts were collected. Pharmacy employees were interviewed. Supply chains were scrutinized. Very quickly, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not a manufacturing accident. The poison bottles had been purchased from multiple retail locations across the Chicago metropolitan area, including suburban grocery stores and drugstores miles apart. The lot numbers did not match. The bottles had been opened, tampered with, and resealed after leaving the factory. Someone had intentionally placed death onto store shelves. This realization changed the entire scope of the investigation. There was no single crime scene to secure, no factory floor to shut down. The crime had occurred in public spaces, in plain sight, without drawing attention. Anyone could have walked into a store, picked up a bottle, altered it, and returned it. The killer did not need access to Johnson & Johnson facilities. They did not need inside knowledge of the company. They only needed time, privacy, and a poison strong enough to kill. Potassium cyanide became the focus of intense scrutiny. Investigators knew it was not commonly available to the general public. It was used in laboratories, industrial processes, and some manufacturing environments. Tracking its source, however, proved nearly impossible. There were no centralized purchase records. No requirement to log buyers in many contexts. The chemical could be stolen, shared, or acquired through secondary channels without leaving a trail. As investigators pursued these leads, Johnson & Johnson faced a decision that would define the case almost as much as the murders themselves. On October 5th, less than a week after the first deaths, the company announced a nationwide recall of every bottle of Tylenol on the market, more than 31 million units. The recall cost the company over $100 million, but executives insisted public safety left them no alternative. Store shelves across the country were stripped bare. For the first time, Americans began to question the safety of products they had never doubted before. Medicine cabinets were emptied. Parents threw away bottles in sealed trash bags. Some refused to keep any over-the-counter medication in their homes at all. The fear was not just about Tylenol anymore. It was about trust. If something as familiar as a pain reliever could be turned into a weapon, then nothing felt entirely safe. Behind the scenes, investigators worked around the clock, aware that time mattered. If the killer intended to strike again, the window was open. Every hour without another death was both a relief and a source of dread. The question hung heavily over the city and the nation. Had the killer stopped, or were they simply waiting? Part 3. The letter that changed everything. As the nation waited for answers, investigators faced an uncomfortable reality. Despite the scale of the panic, they had no suspect, no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence tying anyone to the poison bottles. The killer had left nothing behind except fear. Then, less than a week after the first deaths, a letter arrived. It was sent to Johnson & Johnson and postmarked from New York City. The message was typed, unsigned, and chillingly direct. The sender claimed responsibility for the poisonings and demanded $1 million in exchange for ending the killings. Instructions were included, outlining how the money should be delivered and warning that failure to comply would result in more deaths. For the first time since the murders began, investigators believed they might be hearing directly from the person responsible. The FBI immediately became involved. Handwriting and linguistic experts analyzed the letter, searching for clues hidden in word choice, sentence structure, and tone. What they found raised as many questions as it answered. The letter lacked urgency. It lacked rage. It lacked panic. Instead, it read as calculated, almost detached. The demand for money felt secondary, as though it were an afterthought rather than the true motive. Some investigators began to doubt whether the author of the letter was the killer at all. Still, the possibility could not be ignored. Tracing the letter's origin led authorities to New York, where they identified a man named James William Lewis. Lewis was not a suspect uncovered through forensic work or witness testimony. He surfaced because his name and address were connected to correspondence related to the extortion attempt. Lewis was a drifter with a history of fraud, harassment, and erratic behavior. He had lived in Chicago years earlier and was familiar with the city. When authorities questioned him, he did not deny writing the letter. Instead, he offered an explanation that only deepened suspicion. Lewis claimed he had not poisoned anyone. According to him, the murders were already front-page news when he decided to exploit the situation by sending the extortion letter. He insisted the letter was an attempt to profit from fear, not an admission of guilt. To investigators, the explanation felt dangerously convenient. Why insert yourself into the most closely watched criminal investigation in the country if you were innocent? Why risk federal charges and lifelong suspicion? But suspicion, once again, was not evidence. Authorities searched Lewis's home and belongings. They found firearms. They found writings filled with paranoia and hostility toward institutions. What they did not find was cyanide. There were no Tylenol capsules, no receipts linking him to the contaminated bottles, no proof placing him in the stores where the poisonings occurred. Still, prosecutors moved forward with the only charge they could prove: extortion. Lewis was arrested, tried, and convicted for sending the letter. He was sentenced to prison, not as a mass murderer, but as a man who attempted to profit from mass murder. To the public, the conviction felt like progress. To investigators, it solved almost nothing. The central question remained unanswered. If Lewis was not the killer, then who was? And if he was, how had he managed to leave no trace behind? Part 4. The silence after the poison. After the extortion letter and the arrest of James William Lewis, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No new poison bottles were discovered. No additional deaths were reported. No further threats arrived in the mail. For a crime that had shaken the nation in a matter of days, the sudden silence was deeply unsettling. Investigators had prepared for the possibility of more victims. Hospitals remained on alert. Pharmacies kept shelves empty. Families waited for the next warning. It never came. The question that haunted investigators was simple, but impossible to answer. Why did the killing stop? If the poisonings were driven by greed, then the failure of the extortion attempt should have triggered more violence, not less. If the goal was attention, the nation was watching more closely than ever. And if the goal was revenge, there was no clear target that explained the randomness of the victims. This inconsistency forced investigators to re-examine their assumptions. Some believed the killer had panicked. The nationwide recall, constant media coverage, and involvement of federal agencies may have made further tampering too risky. Every bottle on the shelf was now being watched. Every report of illness was being scrutinized. Others believed the killer had already achieved what they wanted: fear. For several days in 1982, millions of Americans were afraid to take medicine in their own homes. The poisonings had demonstrated a terrifying truth. It was possible to kill strangers without ever seeing them, and without ever being caught. From this perspective, the murders were not the beginning of a campaign, but the entirety of it. This interpretation cast doubt on James Lewis as the primary suspect. Lewis had sought money. The poisoner had sought control. The two motives did not align cleanly. As time passed, the weaknesses in the case against Lewis became more apparent. There was no physical evidence linking him to the cyanide. No witnesses placed him in the stores where the contaminated bottles were found. No proof showed he had access to the specific type of cyanide used in the killings. Even his connection to Chicago was circumstantial. He had lived there years earlier, but not at the time of the murders. Investigators could not place him in the city during the critical window when the tampering occurred. Lewis remained an unsettling figure. His writings were disturbing. His willingness to involve himself in the case was suspicious. But suspicion could not bridge the gap left by missing evidence. As one investigator later admitted, the case against Lewis was built on the absence of better answers. One theory suggested the killer had access to cyanide through professional means, someone working in a laboratory, manufacturing plant, or industrial setting. Such a person would understand both the lethality of the poison and how to obtain it without drawing attention. Another theory proposed that the poisoner was motivated by a desire to test vulnerability rather than kill repeatedly. The randomness of the victim supported this idea. There was no message tied to identity, politics, or ideology. The act itself was the statement. There were also discussions of copycat risk. Investigators worried that public attention might inspire others to attempt similar crimes. This concern influenced how much information was released to the public, potentially limiting leads that might have emerged through transparency. Each theory had merit. None had proof. A case that refused to close. By the mid-1980s, active investigative leads had dwindled. The case remained open, but momentum was gone. New technologies had not yet arrived. DNA analysis was years away. Surveillance culture did not exist. The killer had chosen the perfect moment in history. A time when trust was high, security was low, and accountability was limited. For investigators, the Tylenol murders became a reminder of how fragile control can be. Not every crime announces its perpetrator. Not every horror leaves behind a trail. Some crimes simply stop. And when they do, they leave only questions behind. Part 5. The case that never left. Even as public attention drifted elsewhere, the Tylenol murders never truly faded from law enforcement memory. The case files remained open. Investigators periodically revisited the evidence, hoping that time, distance, or new technology might reveal what urgency could not. But each return ended the same way. There was nothing new to examine, no physical evidence waiting to be reanalyzed, no forgotten witness ready to speak. The murders had produced almost no forensic trail. There were no fingerprints recovered from the bottles, no usable fibers, no DNA preserved inside the capsules. At the time, investigators could not imagine a future in which such evidence might even exist. The killer had left nothing behind except the result. The copycat fear. One of the most immediate fears after the Chicago poisonings was that the crime would inspire others. That fear proved justified. In the years following 1982, several copycat incidents occurred across the United States. Some involved poison medication. Others involved threats that were never carried out. A few resulted in deaths, though none were conclusively linked to the original Tylenol murders. Each new incident reinforced how deeply the original crime had altered the national psyche. Investigators became cautious about what details they released to the public. Information that might once have been shared freely was now withheld, out of concern that it could serve as a blueprint for imitation. This secrecy may have protected the public, but it also narrowed the flow of potential leads. The corporate response that changed everything. While the criminal investigation struggled, the corporate response moved with unprecedented speed. Johnson & Johnson's recall of 31 million bottles became a landmark moment in consumer safety. The company halted production, redesigned packaging, and worked closely with federal regulators to establish new standards. Within months, tamper-evident seals became mandatory across the pharmaceutical industry. Plastic neckbands, foil liners, and sealed blister packs were introduced. The era of open capsules quietly ended. These changes saved countless lives, but they also underscored a bitter truth. The system had changed not because the killer was caught, but because the killer had succeeded. Modern reassessment. As decades passed, journalists and investigators returned to the case with fresh eyes. Documentaries were produced, books were written. Former law enforcement officials spoke openly about their doubts and frustrations. Some believed James William Lewis had been wrongly dismissed. Others believed he had been given too much attention. With his death in 2023, any chance of confession vanished. Modern investigators acknowledged that if the crime occurred today, it would likely unfold very differently. Surveillance cameras would track movements. Purchase histories could be reconstructed. DNA analysis might reveal something overlooked. But 1982 was a different world, and the killer had understood that. A crime that rewrote fear. Unlike many unsolved cases, the Tylenol murders did not fade into obscurity. They became a reference point. Every poisoning case that followed was compared to Chicago. Every safety reform traced its lineage back to those 7 deaths. The murders entered public consciousness not as a story with an ending, but as a lesson without closure. For the families of the victims, that absence mattered most. There was no arrest to accept, no verdict to process, no sentence to mark an end, only silence. Part 6. The questions. that remain more than 40 years after the Tylenol murders, the case remains officially unsolved. There has been no arrest for the poisonings, no murder conviction, no definitive explanation. What remains are questions that refuse to settle. The first is the simplest and the most haunting. Who did this? Despite decades of investigation, no suspect has ever been placed at the scene of the tampering. No witness has come forward to say they saw someone return a bottle to a shelf. No forensic evidence has surfaced to tie any individual to the cyanide-laced capsules. James William Lewis remains the most visible figure connected to the case, but visibility is not guilt. His extortion letter placed him near the center of the investigation, yet it never placed him inside a store, holding a bottle of Tylenol. He was convicted of exploiting the crime, not committing it. When he died in 2023, he took whatever truth he possessed with him. Whether he was a calculating opportunist or something more has never been proven. Another question lingers beneath the surface. Why Chicago? The city was large, busy, and diverse, a place where tampering could go unnoticed. But it was also close-knit enough for panic to spread quickly. Some investigators believe the killer chose Chicago precisely because it offered both anonymity and impact. Others believe the choice was personal, that the killer lived or worked in the area, knew the stores, knew the routines, and understood how to move without drawing attention. There is also the question of access. Potassium cyanide was not something most people could acquire easily in 1982. Its presence suggests either professional access or deliberate effort, yet no employment records, laboratory logs, or industrial thefts ever produced a suspect. The poison appeared in the capsules and then vanished from the trail. Perhaps the most disturbing question of all is why the killing stopped. 7 people died, and then it ended. There was no escalation, no follow-up threat, no second wave. Some investigators believe the killer feared detection once the recall began and media scrutiny intensified. Others believe the act itself was the goal, that the poisonings were meant to demonstrate vulnerability rather than continue indefinitely. In this interpretation, the murders were not a campaign. They were a statement. A statement about how fragile trust could be and how easily it could be exploited. That idea helps explain the randomness of the victims. They were not chosen for who they were, but for what they represented. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, relying on a product they believed was safe. The Tylenol murders did not target individuals. They targeted society's assumptions. And in that sense, the killer succeeded. Before 1982, people did not think twice about opening a bottle of medicine. After Chicago, that innocence was gone. Tamper-evident packaging became law. Safety checks became standard. Fear became part of the equation. The world adapted. Justice did not. For the families of the victims, the absence of answers has been a constant presence. Time has passed. Lives have moved forward. But the questions remain unchanged. Who poisoned the capsules? How did they do it without being seen? Why those people? Why that moment? And why did no one ever confess? The Tylenol murders stand as one of the rare cases where the impact of the crime far outweighs what is known about the criminal. 7 deaths reshaped an entire industry. A handful of capsules rewrote consumer safety. And a single unknown person altered how millions of people interact with the most ordinary objects in their homes. Some cases end with arrests. Some end with trials. Some end with truth. This one ended with silence. This has been Cold Case Archives, where some files remain open not because they were forgotten, but because the answers never came.
Some cases are never closed. Some questions remain unanswered, but every story deserves to be remembered. This has been Cold Case Archives.